Welcome everyone and hello to our new episode of Life Science. Today we will talk about a different topic. We will talk about amphibians. The most famous amphibians that you have ever known are the frogs. So let's know more stuff about amphibians. Did you know that some animals are able to breathe through their skin? Does these animals live on land or live in water? Actually, they live both on land and in the water. About 350 million years ago, fishes lived everywhere where there is warm water, but no vertebrates lived on land. The land in this case had many resources for vertebrates. It had plants and insects for vertebrates to eat, and there were few predators. This is excellent for vertebrates to live on land. But to live on land, vertebrates needed lungs for breathing and legs for walking on land. So what about the moving to land? Amphibians are animals that can live in water and have lungs and also have legs. Scientists think that amphibians evolved from the ancestors of the lungfish-like fishes. These ancient fishes developed lungs that got oxygen from the air that allowed them to live on land. So what is a lung? A lung is a sac-like organ that takes oxygen from the air and delivers oxygen to the blood. Another definition for lung is a respiratory organ in which oxygen from the air is exchanged with carbon dioxide from the blood. These fishes also had strong fins that could have evolved into legs. So the most common amphibians of today, these are frogs and salamanders. Frogs to the left and the salamanders to the right. But early amphibians looked much different. Fossils show that the first amphibians looked like a cross between, this is like a mix between the fish and a salamander. Many were very large, up to 10 meters long. Can you imagine? An amphibian that is 10 meters long? Early amphibians could stay on dry land longer than today's amphibians, but they still had to return to water to keep from drying out or overheating and dying. They also returned to the water in order to mate, to reproduce and lay their eggs. So let's talk more about the characteristics of amphibians. The word amphibian itself, it means a double life. Most amphibians live part of their lives in water and the other part on land. Amphibians' eggs do not have a shell or a membrane that prevents water loss. For this reason, the embryos must develop in a wet environment. Most amphibians live in the water after hatching and then later develop into adults that can live on land. So all the embryos, the young ones, they live in water after hatching, but only the adults can live on land. But even the adult amphibians are only partly adapted to live on land. Amphibians are ectotherms. Do you remember the word ectotherm? So their body temperature depends on the temperature of their environment. They cannot maintain stable internal environment by themselves, but the water helps amphibians keep their bodies at stable temperature. Also, the water helps adults keep from losing too much moisture through their skin. So let's talk more about the skin of amphibians. Amphibian skin is thin, smooth, and moist. The skin is so thin that amphibians absorb water through it instead of drinking. Can you imagine drinking from the skin, absorbing water from the skin instead of drinking? This is amazing. But amphibians can also lose water easily through their skin for the same fact, the thin, smooth skin, and easily become dehydrated. The amphibian's thin skin is one reason that most amphibians live in water or in damp habitats. Amphibians can breathe by gulping air also into their lungs. This is the major one. Amphibians can breathe by gulping air into their lungs, but many also absorb oxygen through their skin. So now the skin for absorbing water and oxygen, which is full of blood vessels. This is the skin. In fact, few amphibians such as this salamander, this is the four-toed salamander. It is named the four-toed salamander because each leg has four toes. This four-toed salamander has no lungs at all and breathe only through their skin. Okay, many amphibians also have brightly colored skin. We're still talking about the skin of amphibians. Many amphibians also have brightly colored skin. The colors often warn predators that the skin contains poison glands. These poisons or toxins may simply be irritating or they may be deadly. Like this one in the picture, it looks very beautiful. This is the poison arrow frog that has one of the most deadly toxins known. Let's move to the double life of amphibians. We already said that amphibians live part of their life in the water and the other part on land. So let's see. Most amphibians do not just get bigger as they grow into adults, but they can change form as they grow. If you remember the metamorphosis, here it is. After hatching, a frog or toad embryo becomes a tadpole. Tadpole. A tadpole is an immature form of frog or toad that must live in the water. It will live in the water, so it must have gills to extract oxygen from the water, and it must have the ability to swim in the water. It gets extra oxygen through the gills and uses its long tail to swim. This is great. Later, the tadpole loses its gills and it develops structures such as lungs to breathe on land and limbs that grow it that allow it to live on land. This change in form from an immature form to the adult form is called metamorphosis, and we studied this before. Most adult amphibians can live on land, however, they still need to keep their skin moist not to lose the water from their body. And here is the amphibian metamorphosis. This is the fertilized egg. When they hatch, the newly hatched tadpole feeds on the yolk stored in its body and uses gills to breathe. Then, after some time, the tadpole begins to grow legs, begins to feed and grow legs. Then, as it grows, the tail and the gills disappear and the lung becomes functional. Now it has the legs and fully functional lungs. Now this is the adult form that can live on land. A few amphibians develop into other ways. Some do not undergo through the full metamorphosis, the complete change in shapes during the life cycle. But these ones, they hatch as tiny versions of the adults, but they have gills. Some develop on land in wet places. For example, the Darwin's frog. This is so interesting. The Darwin's frog lay its eggs on moist ground. When the embryo begins to move, an adult male Darwin's frog takes it into his mouth and protects it inside his vocal sacs. The vocal sac is the sac around below the mouth of the male frogs. So the one that is moving here, these are the small frogs inside its mouth, its vocal sac. When the embryo has finished developing, as you can see in the picture, the adult opens his mouth and the tiny frog jumps out. Then we move to kinds of amphibians. This is so interesting. More than 5,400 species of amphibians are alive today. Can you imagine? They belong only to three groups. Number one, caecilians. Number two, salamanders. And number three, frogs and toads. So the three groups of amphibians are caecilians, salamanders, frogs, and toads. Let's see. What about caecilians? Most people are not familiar with caecilians because they look like earthworms or even like snakes. However, scientists have discovered more than 160 species of caecilians. Caecilians live in tropical areas of Asia, Africa, and South America. Caecilians look like earthworms or snakes, but they have the thin, moist skin of amphibians, unlike earthworms or snakes. Several traits distinguish traits means characteristics. distinguish caecilians from other amphibians. For example, caecilians do not have legs. This is one major difference between caecilians and other amphibians. They do not have legs. Unlike other amphibians, some caecilians have bony scales on their skin for protection. These bony scales on their skin. Salamanders, this is the second group of amphibians. There are about 500 known species of salamanders. As adults, most salamanders live under stones and logs in the woods of North America. Of modern amphibians, salamanders are the most like prehistoric amphibians in the overall form. So they look like their ancestors in the overall form. Although salamanders are much smaller than their ancestors, do you remember they were about 10 meters long? But these ones, the salamanders, are much smaller than their ancestors, and they have a similar body shape, a long tail, and four strong legs. Salamanders can range in size from a few centimeters long up to 1.5 meters long. Salamanders do not develop as tadpoles only the frogs. But most salamanders do lose their gills and grow lungs during their development. A few species, such as the axolotl, never loses its gills. And in the next slide, we will see its shape. These species live their entire life in the water. This salamander, its name is the marbled salamander. As you can see, it looks like the marble. Lives in damp places such as under rocks or logs or among leaves. But the axolotl, this is the salamander that never loses its gills and never leaves the water. This is the unusual salamander. As you can see, the gills are outside the head. As you can see, it looks like hairs. Then we move to frogs and toads. This is so interesting. So what is the difference between frogs and toads? They look much similar to each other, but frogs have smooth skin, as you can see, while toads, the one to the right, have dry, bumpy skin. Also, toads spend less time in water than frogs do. About 90% of all amphibians are frogs and toads. Frogs and toads are very similar. In fact, toads are a type of frog. Frogs and toads live all over the world except for very cold places. They are found in deserts and rainforests. Frogs and toads are highly adapted for life on land. The adults have strong leg muscles. These muscles help it in jumping. Also, frogs and toads have well-developed ears for hearing and vocal cords for calling. What about the tongue? What about the feeding? Frogs and toads also have a long, sticky tongue. Can you see the tongue? Have you noticed that the tongue is attached to the mouth from the front, not from the back like our tongue? Did you see it? So the tongue is attached to the front of the mouth, so it can be flipped out quickly to catch insects, like what you see in these GIFs. What about singing frogs? We all know that the frogs make this sound for singing all over the night. Frogs are well known for their nighttime courses, but many frogs sing in the daytime too. Like humans, frogs force air from their lungs across the vocal cords in the throat to make the sound. So they force the air like the way we talk and I talk right now. We force the air from the lungs out to the vocal cords in order to make the sounds. But frogs do have something that we lack. A thin-walled air sac of skin called the vocal sac. The thin-walled sac of skin called the vocal sac inflates with vibrating air. Can you see it? This is the vocal sac. This is the vocal sac. It is a thin-walled sac of skin, part of the skin that is below the mouth. The sac increases the volume of the sound, like when you put your hands beside your mouth while you are shouting to make your voice louder. The sac increases the volume of the sound so that the song can be heard over long distances. Frogs sing to communicate messages. This is a way of communication that help in attracting mates and marking territories. Usually, frogs sing songs that they know without having to learn these songs. But some frogs can change the notes they sing. For example, to make the voice louder, one frog uses a tree's acoustics. This is the tree trunk that is hollow from inside. The frog uses it to make its voice louder. It sits in a hole in the tree trunk and tries many notes until it finds the loudest one. Then it sings this note repeatedly to be as loud as possible. Then the last part of our lesson for today, amphibians as ecological indicators. Ecological, this is related to ecology or to the environment. Indicator means this is like attention or like an alarm system. Amphibians are often called ecological indicators. In other words, unhealthy amphibians can be an early sign of changes in the ecosystem. When large numbers of amphibians begin to die or show deformities changing in shape, a problem in the environment may exist. For example, the disappearance of the golden toad, this is the golden toad, caused concern about the toad's environment. Golden toads were seen regularly in Costa Rica until 1989. Can you imagine after that year, they disappeared. The amphibians are ecological indicators. Why? Can you guess? Because they breathe through their skin. So if there is any contamination in the air, they will be affected. Also, they drink through their skin. So any contamination in the water or any pollution in the water, they will be affected. Amphibians are ecological indicators because they are very sensitive to changes in their environment. Their skin absorbs any chemicals in the water or air, and their lungs take in chemicals from the air. The climate change is another factor that may affect amphibians as ectotherms. Do you remember the ectotherms? Animals that cannot maintain stable body temperature or depend on the environment to warm their bodies or get a stable temperature. As ectotherms, their body temperature depends on the temperature of their environment. So any change in the climate will affect the amphibians in this particular area. I hope you enjoyed and understood this episode about the amphibians. See you in the next one. Thank you guys and goodbye.